for the next 6 weeks, we're going to be doing a Bible study in our home, and we have a special Bible study leader who's going to be leading the Bible study. And we'd love for you to come to our home. This is not something we're announcing. We're keeping it to about 35 or 40 people. And so I said, oh, that'd be great. That's because I always knew that Truman and Kitty laid out a good spread of appetizers. I was a single guy, so it was a good thing to do. So I went, and the guest Bible study leader was Hal Lindsey. And so it was incredible. Every week we heard Hal Lindsey. And so the first week, Hal Lindsey starts, and he starts going, and he was a very charismatic, very interesting kind of a guy, told incredible stories. But he was maybe 15 minutes in, and I raised and asked a question. And he went along about 10 more minutes. I raised my hand and asked a question. And he went about another 10 minutes. And so it was obvious he was starting to get a little frustrated. I was asking questions. And in fact, nobody else in the room, I realized after my great intuition of what the room. And but I kept asking some questions. So that was week one. Week two, we're into the Bible study. We're less than 5 minutes in. I raised my hand and asked a question. And we're maybe 5 more minutes. I raised my hand. He stops and he goes, could you just wait till the end and ask a question? And I said, well, okay, except at the beginning you said if any of you have questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask. And he said, well, now I'm taking that back. Wait till the end and ask questions. And so we waited to the end. So between week 2 and week 3, Truman and Kitty called me over to their house, and they said, Steve, we love having you in this Bible study. However, Hal has asked if you would not ask so many questions. And I said, oh, okay. He wants to basically just kind of unload on us and that kind of thing. And I, kind of said it. Actually, I said it like that. And so I went through a couple more weeks. And then after about the 4th week, Hal, after the Bible study, asked if I would stay. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So I stayed afterwards. Everybody left. And he said, I understand that Truman and Kitty talked to you and told you not to be asking questions. And I said, well, yeah, they did. And he said, I noticed that you weren't asking as many questions, but he said, I appreciate that. He said, I sort of want to take that back. And he said, I understand you're about to head to Scotland to go to graduate school in law and ethics. And he said, you're going to a place you need to be asking a lot of questions. And he said, I feel bad about the fact that I have kind of discouraged you from asking questions. And so while I'd rather you not ask a lot of questions the last 2 weeks you're here, when you go to Scotland, ask a lot of questions. So that's my Hal Lindsey story. That's the only time with Hal Lindsey, the late, great Planet Earth. I still never finished that book. I read part of the book, but I could never finish that book. But it's interesting. So did we get everybody introduced? If not, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Rankin. Esther was not feeling good today, so Steve Rankin is pinch hitting. He's going to introduce Steve Garber. And then we're going to let Steve speak, and then we're going to have a Q&A time toward the end.
Well, good morning. Some of us in this room know who Larry Norman is. Okay, I'm sorry that Esther is a little under the weather, but I am tickled I get this opportunity to introduce our speaker this morning. I am going to read Esther's brief introductory bio, and then want to say one thing about Steve Garber. Dr. Stephen Garber served at Regent College from 2017 to 2020 as professor of marketplace theology and leadership, and as director of Regent's Master of Arts in Leadership, Theology, and Society. Prior to his time at Regent, he served as principal of the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation, and Culture in Washington, D.C. Stephen completed his Ph.D. in the philosophy of learning at Pennsylvania State University, focusing on the connection between belief and behavior. In addition to his many articles, his published works include The Fabric of Faithfulness, Weaving Together Belief and Behavior and Visions of Vocation, Common Grace for the Common Good. When I was still at SMU some years ago, we invited Stephen Garber to come to SMU to lecture, and we were using his book, Visions of Vocation, with a group of students that we had started working with called Faith and Learning Scholars. And the book is tremendous, and it was great to have Stephen on campus, and I was really tickled when I saw that he was to be one of our speakers today. So it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Garber.
Does it seem to be okay? When these first came out into the world years ago, I remember thinking, I don't want to be Britney Spears in this life. I'm not going to do it that way. And then, of course, it just sort of evolved over time that we will all do it this way. So, not Britney Spears this morning, but here I am. Steve, thank you for the invitation to be with you and your good brothers and sisters for these few days. And Steve, thank you for your introduction. We sat beside each other last night at the dinner, and I thought, I remember you, because we had a good few days in Dallas at SMU, and actually, out of all that, have a common younger friend who we both said, he is a prince, isn't he? And he is that. So you influenced him, and I've had a friendship with him, too, over the many years now. So thank you for that. I remember about 20 years ago, Steve, you asked me, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's 15 years ago now, to come to join this group at the College of the Preachers in Washington, D.C., at the National Cathedral. And you gave me a very specific assignment for that time. You said, would you come and talk with us about the pastoral meaning of the novel Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry? And I know at least one of you was there, who I've kept up with over the years since then. But a very particular assignment, and we had an interesting time together thinking about who Wendell Berry is and what the Port William membership is about and who Jayber Crow was and what, in fact, might be the pastoral meaning of the novel for how we think about, a life in the church in and through the John Wesley Fellowship. So, and here we are again some years later, so thank you for that. Maybe 30, 40, 35 years ago, I was invited to come to Houston, my first visit ever. I remember being overwhelmed by the highways, the freeways, 12 lanes in either direction, just thinking, sheesh, I grew up in California, which is to my mind, sort of the home of freeway life, and I never saw so many lanes in one direction going anywhere in the world, really. And then all of a sudden, we're driving along this massive highway, and I see a pickup truck beside us, not an unusual thing, I suppose, in Texas at large, or even Houston in particular, but a pickup truck emblazoned on the back of the bumper sticker, American by birth, Texan by the grace of God. I thought, well, here I am in Houston, Texas. And over the years, I've come back to Texas again and again. From the piney woods to the Rio Grande, spending many weekends in Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston, coming to know and love its people, committed as they are, as they must be, to being Texans by the grace of God. And then this, too, is a little moment before we step in. If we had hours together over time, I know I would linger over the nature of longing, so deeply Augustinian that I am. At the heart of who we are our longings. What do we most care about? And I'm sure that I would begin with Houston's most iconic song ever, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places, from the film Urban Cowboy. And then I'd make sure that we listen carefully to Texas's novelist laureate, Larry McMurtry, best known for his Lonesome Dove series, but the author of many books, each one a story of longings disordered, of longings misdirected. And then somehow we would weave all that into more conversation together about the nature of theological formation in the 21st century. But not this time. We have other questions to take up, and we will. So, for labor, for learning, for liturgy, why vocation matters for the whole of life. God in heaven, bless us, we pray. Help us to be attentive to you, to each other, as we listen and learn together in this learning center, even as it's named. So We pray to you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to be among us as we think together about things that matter to us and to you, as you watch over your world, as you are present in your world, as you are with us in this world, longing as we are for you to come to make all things be right and well. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Bah humbug, bah humbug, bah humbug. There isn't a person in the room, of course, who doesn't recognize those two simple little words, bah humbug. Of course, they come from that immemorial story, written over the course of just about 2 weeks. Charles Dickens was in some ways born of a sense of responsibility for the world around him, the city of London, for watching the poor and the disenfranchised and realizing that they got the short end of every stick. But also he was a father of a big family, and he knew he had to get something done to pay the next bills. And so in 2 weeks, I think as the story is, he wrote A Christmas Carol. It is the story of a vocation, of course, isn't it? The story of a life from its first years to its last years. A boyhood full of loves and longings, youthful ambitions and hopes, then the settling in years where we become who we will be, for blessing and for curse. And over time, year after long year, we live into the reality that both the body and the soul keep score, very painfully so for Mr. Scrooge. But the core questions of calling for everyone everywhere thread their way through A Christmas Carol. Who are we? Why are we? And what will we do with our lives? And then, of course, in the long, dark night of Ebenezer's soul, on the very precipice of eternity, he's given the grace of looking into these three questions. Who am I? Why am I? What have I done with my life? And you know the story almost as well as you know the story of your own life. The questions which form the story of a life form the story of his life, of every life. Theologically rooted as they are, they're the most human questions of all. Sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, the world over wakes up in the morning living into their answers, sometimes very attentively and thoughtfully, and perhaps more often than not, simply trying to keep alive one more day, not paying much attention. But they are our questions. My last trip to Houston was a summer ago, middle of July, very blue sky, and hot and more hot too. Maybe 3 years earlier, I'd been asked by an Anglican church in Durham, North Carolina, to come spend a weekend with them. I flew from Vancouver, BC, across the continent to Durham, and they had a Lilly Endowment grant given to churches across the country to explore more fully over the course of a year the meaning of vocation for the church and for the world. And so they were working at this, over that period of time. They said, we're all reading your book, Visions of Vocation. Would you come spend a weekend with us? We want to think with you about it, what you've written. So I made my way there, and we spent a Friday night through a Sunday morning together. And I'm looking at your faces. We're in this cavernous room. It's much less intimate, of course, than where we were earlier today. And I felt a little bit intimidated by thinking, I'm going to be with Dumbledore and everybody else here this morning. And it's too big to speak very intimately. But that Friday night, I stepped in, and then Saturday morning we got together again. And because I was watching faces, I was noticing there was a person in the group who seemed to be skeptical to me, thinking, I don't know who you are, but wish I was being more persuasive, I suppose. And I just took it in and took a deep breath and kept on. And when lunchtime came, he said to me, can we go for a walk? And I said, I remember thinking to myself, are you sure? If you're going to scorch me, I'm not sure I want to talk to you, but sure, I'll take your question, And so we went for a walk, then about 2 or 3 hours of a walk around a lake outside of Durham. And it turned out his name was Ehsan Sameh, S-A-M-E-I, Ehsan Sameh. He was Muslim by background, a musician by birth, and a medical doctor too. He was at that point in his life the head of radiology at the Duke University Medical School. The short little story of his life is this: raised centuries upon centuries as a Muslim. He loved math and music as a boy, loved especially the flute, became a very serious flautist in his 15, 16, 17-year-old years. His tutor impressed upon him the importance of learning Bach. And so he prepared a whole recital for family and friends of Bach's music. And he memorized, and he worked, and he labored, and finally, the very last night before the recital was to happen, he played the whole set of selections to his teacher. And his teacher stopped him and said, "Hey, son, you cannot do this tomorrow night after all." And his son said, "But I have to. Everyone's going to come, and I've worked so hard at this." And he said, "But listen, hey, son, this is Johann Sebastian Bach. And I've not heard Jesus yet in your music." And he said, as a Muslim, I had no idea what he was saying to me. I had no idea what he said when he said, "I've not heard the cross of Christ yet in your music." And he said, well, I took it and I played my songs the next night and I went on with my life. And finally I got to the States for graduate school, and I went here and I went here and then here. And then finally, before he was out of his 20s, he was in the Duke Medical School and spent the rest of his life there, actually. And we went on that walk, and he said to me, not scorching me, which I was grateful to hear. It wasn't like, "What on earth are you saying to all of us?" But he said, "I've never before in my life heard this idea of vocation before." And he said, if what you're saying is true, it might just change the way I see the work of my life. In fact, my life. And so we talked and we talked. We've been talking for several years since then, actually. And then about a year and a half, 2 years ago now, he was appointed the president of the American Academy of Medical Radiology. About 10,000 people across the U.S., and all different kinds of people who do CAT scans and MRIs that we all depend upon. That's what his oversight is of that trade association, professional association. He says, I get the opportunity, though, of deciding on the presidential symposium this year, and I'm going to choose to actually address the vocation of medical physicist. And would you come be part of it with me, to talk with me about this here in Houston? So I, months later, thought through the whole thing and about medical radiology, what I mostly don't know about all that, and I thought about, Michael Polanyi and about the Enlightenment and about a lot of other ideas about what vocation and the sciences mean, and in fact, of course, what it might mean to be, as he put it to me, our stumbling block day by day is we're called to wear two hats. We're both supposed to be bedside docs and also scientists. And he says, I've never been able to think through how it all could be somehow more coherent. But he says, maybe this idea of vocation could give us the coherence to make sense of a whole life, of all of who we're supposed to be in the world. Well, we're going to fix ourselves for a few minutes on vocation and why it matters. On vocation and why it matters. I have for, 30, 35 years or so, been a pretty attentive student of a man named James Houston. And James Houston was a Plymouth Brethren missionary kid in Avila, Spain, actually. He says it's ironic in its own providential way because, of course, over time, he said, I began to be quite a student of Teresa of Avila. But my family actually were sent by the Plymouth Brethren assemblies of the world to Avila to bring the gospel to this part of Spain. And I grew up there, and then I went off to school and more school, and finally ended up as an Oxford Don teaching geography at Hereford College. And did that for about 25 or 30 years until he was finally persuaded by some Plymouth Brethren business people in Vancouver, British Columbia, to leave that notable city of steeples and spires and move across the world to Vancouver, BC, to do what? To start an idea, to bring an idea. He called it Regent College in the early 1970s. And I have been very attentive to him for a long time. But along the way of those years, he persuaded me, in fact, that his own first vision for Regent, which really never came into being in all the ways it should have and could have, but he said, my vision was to be a place where you could learn to be as theologically mature as you were professionally competent. As theologically mature as you were professionally competent. Now here's James Houston, Oxford Don, geographer by profession, by training. Those who watched him most carefully would say over the course of the years of his life, after leaving Oxford, moving to Vancouver, teaching in Vancouver and all over the world, he became truly a geographer of the soul, which would be a very deep and true expression of his own sense of vocation. But in that idea as theologically mature as you are professionally competent. Dr. Houston was reflecting, of course, about this vision of a seamlessness across the whole of life, of the idea of having an integral faith. Maybe not an integrated faith, but an integral faith. Drawing upon biblical words like tamim in the Hebrew language, which come to us in words like integrity, completeness. I don't know how it is. In fact, in Wesleyan theology, perfectionism comes out etymologically. But of course, there is a theological, biblical thread through the whole of the scriptures which speak about you be perfect as the Lord your God is perfect. You be holy. You be somebody of integrity. Tamim is the Old Testament word. And Dr. Houston, of course, was quite taken by not just the history of the world, the geographies of the world, not only the history of spirituality in the world, which was his great interest, but of course by whether the biblical text, in fact, teaches this idea of a vocation which could, in fact, cover the whole of one's life. I would say, brothers and sisters, that we stumble over this as the church in the world, all over the world. In the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in Australia, in the Middle East, we stumble and we stumble again. And though I could tell you stories until all the cows in Texas came home, I will offer one here from my life in Virginia. Maybe 10 years ago, I was asked to speak at a weekend retreat. It happened to be a men's retreat for a congregation, and went off into the Piedmont of Virginia for the weekend, and Friday night and Saturday and then Sunday. And when Sunday's morning presentation was over, a group of about 5 guys walked up to me. They said, "Can we talk to you for a while?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "Well, we have a friend who's from New York City who's come with us because we thought he might be interested in all of this. And he has something he wants to say to you." And so it was obvious immediately he was British. And he said, I've spent my whole life in the place where technology and business meet each other. I went to the university, came to the States, came to a serious faith as a university student. But for 30 years, he said, I have felt like I was a little bit second class as a Christian. Because you see, I became a pretty serious lover of God as a 20-year-old in my life. At age 25, I was even more purposeful and serious about how intentional I was going to be about following God in the world. But he said, for 25 years, I have felt like I've heard in the church wherever I've been, well, too bad you had to go into business, of course, because, it would have been more important for you to actually have served God with your life in the world. He said to me, with his eyes, I don't know whether he was tearful, but he had tears in his heart. And he said, I just want you to know that a wound in my heart has been healed this weekend. Why the wound, friends? Why the wound? Where does it come from? You see, it's a fragmenting, of course, of the way we understand liturgy and learning and labor and life. We have somehow decided, in fact, rather than seeing them as one holy life before the face of God, we will imagine them instead to be of different meanings, with different weights, and some matter more to God than others. At the end of the day, this is not rocket science. What do we pray for when we gather together in worship? What songs do we sing? Those are fingers to the wind of what we believe about what matters to God, and therefore what ought to matter to us. But we stumble over this all over the face of the earth. We stumble. I've been in Nashville a lot in my life, and I remember one time somebody in the music world saying he had a next-door neighbor who wanted to talk about some of these very ideas, and we got together for breakfast one morning and before the day got started, and we talked for probably an hour and a half, and his neighbor was many years a neighbor, a good friend, a dear friend, I suppose, and was an ophthalmologist by training. When I had gone off to the university from his family where his father was a physician and a pretty serious Christian, as he said it to me. Went off to medical school, came back home to be an ophthalmologist with his father in the practice, and probably, 15 years or so into his practice as a physician of the eye, and he said, I have questions, though, and we talked, and finally, as we were getting up, he said, if this idea of vocation really is true, it would just change everything. But for all of his family upbringing, church upbringing, his university years in a campus ministry, his coming back home, being part of a church for years and years, as he said, I just never have thought about that, in fact, as an idea that might give shape and substance to my life, that might give, in fact, meaning to my work, in fact, as a physician of the eye, as an ophthalmologist. Well, it gives new meaning, of course, to words like, do you have eyes that see? But, of course, he longed somehow to have more coherence in his life. These words, calling and vocation, you are smart people in this room by the mercies of God to you, and you've been studying people, you've worked and thought, and you've gone here and you've gone there, and you've read this and you've read that. I have some sense of that. It's a little bit weighty to me to think how smart you all are, actually. So when I even say something like this, it's not new to you if we think about it very carefully. But the words calling and vocation are really the same word. So it isn't really important, in fact, to say, well, you see, my calling and my vocation, because we can use one word and it means the same word, really. Vocation, not surprisingly, comes because most good words have an etymological history like this. It comes from vocal, vox, vocare. So it's a long word, really, a long word in the Oxford English Dictionary. It goes way, 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 way back. But it comes, of course, from the assumption that something has been said, and then even maybe more importantly, we can hear what has been said. Vocation, calling, of course, is the more Greek version of that. Vocation is the Latin version of the same idea. We could spend a lot more time talking about that. But you see, at the heart of it is this. Something has been said, and we're able to hear. Someone has called us, and we're able to respond. One of the great teachers of my life was John Stott. After years of pastoral ministry in London with his friend Billy Graham, he invited several thousand people to Lausanne, of serious faith and hope and love, to join them in Lausanne, Switzerland, in the early 1970s, to come together to consider the meaning of the gospel of the kingdom for the modern world. 7-8 years after that first Lausanne gathering, Stott was asked to give a series of lectures at Oxford. And he chose to speak on 5 words, given how brilliant and good and pastoral Uncle John turned out to be over the years of his life. And the first word was the word mission. And when Steve was at the Murdoch Trust, we actually talked about it so much, Steve, that you actually published a version of that address, that chapter, which IVP published in a book called Christian Mission in the Modern World. It's all 5 words in the 5 addresses that Stott gave. But we distributed them all over the place for a number of years. Then when I was at Regent was so taken by the same idea, they published a Regent College version of the same chapter with an introduction that I wrote for it. But it's essentially Stott arguing with his own incredible pastoral insight, exegetically, theologically, biblically, walking through the idea of mission from beginning to end. And especially focusing on the mission of Jesus, because he takes up, as he should have, the prayer in the Gospel of John, Father, as I've been sent into the world, then so I send you. So he argues, in fact, that the mission of Jesus is to be the mission that we take up too then. Does that for 15 or so pages, wrestles a little bit with some of the conundrums of the church in the modern world of evangelism and social responsibility, and why do we get picked over by these 2 horns that take us in different directions? Why couldn't we actually see all this as one, in fact, work of God in the world? But then he comes to a place in the address where he says, now, after all this, there are practical implications. And he says, and we must first of all begin with vocation. Because we've taught the wrong thing in the church and the world about the meaning of vocation. We've created a hierarchy. And of course, these 2 stories I've told you represent the hierarchy. People feeling like, well, I was pretty serious as a 22-year-old about my new faith in Jesus, but I thought maybe I should be a businessman and not work for, Campus Crusade after all. Pick your place, but that's one place we'll pick on today. And I spent 30 years in business. I've been an ophthalmologist for all these years of my life, and you mean there's an idea actually that somehow is rooted in biblical, theological seriousness that might give coherence to my life, to all of my life? You see, it's not so far from a son, not raised in that same world, but coming in the maturity of his own life and thinking, here I am, what is he, in his 50s now, the head of radiology at Duke Medical School, thinking, I've never heard the idea of vocation before. Because you see, I wrestle all day long with the tension within me. How do I be a bedside doc at 8:30 in the morning and then at 2:30 in the afternoon try to examine these most intensive, complicated, slides, that make sense of whether we need to amputate your leg or not. How do I do all that and be one man, be one human being at the same time? You see, friends, we have work to do here. And Uncle John put it that way. If we're going to get the mission of Christ right, as he put it, we have to first of all begin with rethinking what we teach about vocation. I have for years argued that these words are at the very center of my own sense of life, my own sense of calling, good word that is, the credo of my own work in the world, that vocation is integral, not incidental to the Missio Dei. But the Catholics miss this. The Orthodox miss this. The Protestants miss this too. In their own distinctive ways, each falls, each stumbles over maybe their own distinctive dualisms. Some years ago, 15, 20 years ago now, the Lilly Endowment, grand giver of lots of money to lots of good things in the world, decided under Craig Dykstra's leadership to create a grant, a very generous, very visionary grant called Programs in the Theological Exploration of Vocation. And they invited people to apply, and it was competitive, but eventually 90 universities and colleges got $2 million from the Lilly Endowment to explore at that notable Wesleyan institution called Duke University, the Wesleyan vision of vocation at the heart of the university's life. Baylor got $2 million to do the same thing for the Baptists. Notre Dame got $2 million for the Catholics, and on and on and on. Bigger schools, smaller schools, got $2 million to explore, in fact, what does it mean to be a school born of this ecclesial tradition and begin to work at it, understanding a vocation that will be a gift to our students in their lives into the future. I had a call from the endowment a couple of years into the grant. They said, we see your name on how this money is used. Do you have any ideas about this? And I remember sitting in my driveway and it was, thinking, well, I have an idea actually. And the idea was born of my reading of Leslie Newbigin some years earlier. And I have been deeply apprenticed, I will say more about this later, by Leslie Newbigin in my thinking about life and the work of God in the world. But I said, when I first read the Gospel in a Pluralist Society, I was taken by it. When I read it, and I invited my closest friends to read it with me. We gathered in Union Station on Capitol Hill to read and think and talk about what Newbigin was saying to all of us. But we got to the last chapter, and there's an argument that Newbigin makes that I remember thinking, you can't say this at the end of the book, Newbigin. The congregation is the hermeneutic of the gospel? It seemed like the mouse that roared, like, I wanted something bigger than that. I wanted a grander argument for some way to taking the work of God into the world, because this is the incisive, perceptive, probing, magisterial work you've done on the meaning of the gospel in a pluralist society, and the congregation is a hermeneutic of the gospel? Oh. But I told the Lilly Endowment folks who called me that day, I was younger then. I think a little bit older in my life, I realized he was right, and I just didn't know enough yet in my life. So I said, in my mind, you've misjudged maybe the program a little bit, even with all the generosity and vision and hope you've had, because you've chosen Catholic, Calvinist, Baptist, and on and on and on and on schools, but you've left out the church in this grant. Because it seems to me, I just picked on Notre Dame and South Bend. I said, can you imagine an undergraduate? She has been in Notre Dame for 3 or 4 years, and she might have come into the program in the last 2 or 3 years of her life there. And then she's finished her studies at Notre Dame, and she goes off to Chicago for her first job. I said, the problem is she will bump into the realpolitik of the marketplace immediately. Because people are not hiring for vocations, they're hiring for jobs. That'll be a disappointment to her. You think, I was so taken by a vocation that gave meaning to the whole of my life, and I have to have a job instead? Oh, I didn't want that, really. But then I said to the Lilly folks, but even pushing that on a few years, she will eventually bump into the real ecclesiastique of the church. Not able to find a parish in the whole city which preaches or prays as if vocation matters to the work of God in the world. And that'll be even worse for her. And she gets to be 30 years old, and she'll look back on her undergraduate years and think, well, I was 21 at the time, wasn't I? The world just isn't like that, and neither is the church. I better grow up. And realize, in fact, I'm going to have to settle for, I'm not sure she would use the word, but I would offer you the word, some more compartmentalized account of what I believe and how I live in the world. Well, the Lilly folks thought that probably was true after all, and we entered into a relationship together for a number of years. And I spent years of my life actually traveling across the country, from the Hamilton, Massachusetts of the world to the Pasadena, Californias of the world, and stopping at the Durham, North Carolinas of the world, and the St. Louis's of the world, talking to seminary presidents and deans, essentially asking the question, so how do you teach vocation to your students? And you know what I heard all across America? Everywhere I went. Good people doing good work as they were. What you're saying is what we believe, but we don't teach that here. What you're saying is what we believe, but we don't teach that here. And I groaned all the way across America, believing the gospel of the kingdom as I do, yearning for the church to be the church as I do, my heart wrapped around the credo, vocation is integral, not incidental to the Missio Dei. Integral, well, written to the very meaning, that's integral, written into its very meaning. Woven into the tapestry, integral, unable to define its meaning without. It's sort of like Texas and the Alamo, like Texas and its Longhorns, like Texas and its Cowboys. You get the picture, don't you? Because the picture is not a picture without. Integral is the word. At the heart of my own heart, I am a mere Christian, my brothers and sisters, as consciously as possible, living within the contours and commitments of historic orthodoxy through the centuries, spending my heart on the questions that true Christians have asked and answered through time. I have my own history, like all of you do, with ecclesial and theological beliefs that place me in an Anglican church week by week, where Isaac Wardell actually leads us in music week by week. But it's also true that I live my life among both Calvinists and Catholics. I listen to Russian Orthodox theologians as I pay attention to Dutch Calvinist theologians, and more and more. And of course, with true singleness and gladness of heart, I'm with you this week, those who've taken up with methodical piety of the Wesley brothers, giving your lives to bringing Spirit-led renewal to the church in our world of the 21st century. And as must be, these are the conversations of my life, day after day, year after year, and again, good people wanting to understand more completely what the idea of vocation means for life, and pointedly, for their lives. Take Monday of this week, for example, a Zoom call with Pittsburgh, a phone call with Annapolis, another Zoom call this time with San Diego, then a phone call with Phoenix, another phone call with Dallas, a lingering conversation with someone in Charlottesville. In the middle of the day, a lunch with Nathan, who for 25 years has lived here in Houston, Texas. Nathan, I met as a 21-year-old undergraduate. He was a student of mine for a while. Come to Washington, D.C. to think about life and the world, particularly the political world, and what might be possible and important in that world. Now at age 53, he's still longing to make sense of making sense, still intrigued by the vision of a vocation that could give coherence to the whole of his life, to all of who he is, to all of who he longs to be. After graduate study, he won a plum position. I will underscore and put it in italics, a plum position with a company that was promising to remake the world, and he wanted to be part of it. 3 years later, Enron imploded, and he lost his job. But as he told me, that he did so was the best thing that ever happened to him. Everything good that's been his life since then came from that. No longer the boy that he was when we met, he's now the father of his own college-age children, who have their own questions about life and learning, about making sense of making sense. Nathan's life is his, as his children's lives are theirs, as Asan's life is his. But every one of us hopes upon hope that we're not alone in the universe, that we're not lost in the cosmos, fated to live and move and have our being in a silent planet, that no one is there and that no one has spoken. To say it again, he is still longing to make sense of making sense, still intrigued by the vision of a vocation that could give coherence to the whole of his life, to all of who he is, to all of who he longs to be. That's why we talked on Monday for lunch. And that's why we'll talk again and again. He told me towards the end, he said, Steve, after all these years, I've just seen a lot more. I've lived a lot longer. And I have to say about some of the things that I do care about and I once believed so plainly in my heart, I'm more agnostic now. I'm just not sure really about what they're about. I'm just not sure. When we sang this morning, I am with you. I am with you. I am with you. I am with you. For I've called you by name. Your labor is not in vain. Not sure what happened here, but we're off screen. Okay. Well, you see, Nathan's questions are his questions, and yet there are questions too, aren't they? And I will say with some professorial and pastoral tenderness, now into his 50s, he has questions upon questions. He's seen more, and he's lived more. And decades later, his life is more complex than he thought it would possibly be at age 20. But I know that he hopes that there are good answers to his good questions, honest answers to his honest questions. The very idea of vocation is that God is there, that he is here, Holy Trinity that he is, and that he's spoken, that we're able to respond. As Václav Havel has said so tellingly, the secret of man is the secret of his responsibility. That is the heart of our humanity. We are able to respond, that we are responsible, to hear and to understand, to make sense of enough of life in the world that we're able to live in the world. Nathan longs for that to be true. Well, in film history, there is an iconic moment that actually is cinematically incarnate here in Houston, Texas. It came from a film filmed literally 20 years ago, so 1994. The film was called Reality Bites. Reality Bites. If you don't know the film, I'll just give you the thumbnail here. But it's a group of 21-year-olds who are just graduating from, it could be Rice University, it could be University of Houston, it's not named really. But the graduation ceremony is where the film begins, and you'll see this a little bit in a moment or so. And Winona Ryder is giving the graduation speech as the undergraduate honored student, and that's where we'll look and finish, really. But they go off into the world, and of course the title is what? Reality Bites. You know, it's a little bit like my story to the Lilly Endowment about the vocation grant to the Catholic students who are going off to Chicago's of the world. Well, you see, it'll be the realpolitik of the marketplace, then finally the real ecclesiastic of the church. It just gets harder, it gets more complex. It's like my saying to Nathan on Monday, you know, I listened to you, Nathan. I realize you're no longer 21 and my prize student. Now you're 53 and reality's bitten, hasn't it? You know, even here in Houston, Texas. It's even bitten you here, you know. And what are you going to do? How are you going to move beyond this pushing back away from the proper confidence, to remember Newbegin, of my faith and my hope and my love, into a faith, in fact, that might, in fact, keep making sense of all of who you are? Well, reality bites. So, hope this all works. Not going to work. Anyway, I had this all keyed up, and it worked on my computer, but then it doesn't work sometimes either. But it's the commencement address. All the parents and the friends are gathered together in the great stadium, and Winona Ryder is there at the podium, and she has her notes, and she's going through, and she's, you know, this and this and this, and the world is like this, and you've given it this, and we're not going to do this, we're going to do this instead. And she says, and my friends, the simple answer is, she's got her pages like this, and she's looking, and she says, and the simple answer is, and the answer is, and then silence for a moment. And the answer is, I don't know. And that's where the story begins. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And you see, we may not be Winona Ryder giving the commencement address of our lives, or Ethan Hawke playfully, painfully wrestling with the crisis of his own calling into the rest of life. But we recognize the weight of our own lives and loves. And by great grace, dear people, we're not stuck in that moment. The world in which we live and move and have our being is not karma. in either its pantheistic or materialist forms, in its Eastern or Western versions. That it's not as a line in the sand, existentially and cosmically. We're not stuck in time and place, just as Scrooge was not stuck in his, which is why most of us will find our way into Dickens again this Christmastide, needing and wanting to hear one more time this story. It's a world we know, inside out, because we know Scrooge, because we know ourselves. His life isn't ours. The contours of his being are not ours. And yet, the genius of the story is that people the world over see themselves in the story, achingly, eerily familiar as it is. And to say it simply, Scrooge's vocation was his and not ours. The way he answers the questions of a life were uniquely his, we will answer them for ourselves. Who are we? Why are we? What will we do with our lives? In these days of December, as we remember that God is the greatest grace, who has entered into history, choosing to dwell for a while among us, to calling us as his people to himself and to his world, that we're called to see and to hear and to feel the world as God has, called to know our time and place, and by surprising grace, to love our time and place. Able to respond, we are responsible for love's sake. And that is the heart of vocation, always and everywhere. Well, can we talk a little bit together?
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to ask a question to get us going. I'm sure you have questions stirring, so we'll have a few minutes of Q&A here. The organization of which we are a part was founded on the vision of renewal of the church. And in those days, it was really the United Methodist Church. And I think we often feel the tension between really the beautiful, engaging, exciting work of kind of mentoring the student, sort of we know the institutional realities are what they are, and I'm a professor in a school and I can really focus on the student. There's that way of addressing the vocational question. There's also the sense, I think, in this group that we've had a sense of a larger vision, like a bigger sense of renewal. But then there's the reality that you're talking about. As you think about our time, the present time, do you have a sense of, let me just ask it this way, do you have a word for us about what you think a group like this should aim at as we move forward?
Wow. Wait for tomorrow, okay?
Okay.
Steve and I are long friends and long collaborators and long kindred spirits, but he said, would you talk about vocation and then the proximate? And I said, okay. So that was some months ago, and here we are on the very edge of the whole shebang. So I've spent some time today thinking out loud about vocation, the church, and the world, which in some ways we could walk into that pretty deeply, Steve. But I have prepared something for tomorrow on the proximate, and I'll just give you the teeniest little, 2-cent version of it. But some years ago, I was asked by a magazine in Canada, a journal called Comment, said, you've been watching Washington, D.C. for a long time. Is there a vocation in the political world? And I gave them an essay I called Making Peace with Proximate Justice. And my deeper, work has always been about the question of how do you sustain and clarify a sense of vocation through the years of life? How do you keep at it? How do you keep going? How do you keep on keeping on? That's been who I have been for all the years of my adult life, basically. And the proximate is a word that we'll get at tomorrow, but Steve, it's like, how do you live between times? I mean, how do you work at things you think matter to history, to God, to the commonweal, the commonwealth, the common good? How do you work at things you think are important to work at when you know that everything you want to happen won't happen. I'll just pick my city of glory and ruin, Washington, D.C. If you come thinking, well, it's public justice for me. I met my brother Matthew, from Africa here, and we've talked a little bit about public justice or his questions at SPU, and that's been my life really of thinking about these things. Vocations in the public square. Well, it doesn't matter what the questions are going to be, whether it's immigration reform or U.S. relations to Israel. You could be as smart as they come. You could be as well-resourced as Texas could allow you to be. When it's all said and done, you won't get it all done. It won't happen, really, because it's just too messy in the world, too much of a wounded world that is. So how do you keep going will be tomorrow's focus, Steve. But yes, I think about that all the time, basically, because I'm most of all interested in the conversations with the Nathans of the world who have lived long enough to think it's harder than I thought it was going to be. And I want to believe, but he said, on some of these things, Steve, I'm just agnostic. I just don't know what to say. I want it to be true, but can it be? And is it possible for it to be? I hope it is. Can we talk about that, Steve? Can we keep talking about this? So that's where we finished our lunch on Monday. Yeah.
Okay. I'll bring you the mic.
So much I loved. I want to ask you about the relationship of parents when it comes to thinking about young people and vocation. So many times, in talking with young people, and God has awakened them to some calling in their life, and there's just so much energy and excitement and clarity in the life of the young person. And you talked about the church's role, but the parental role becomes the place I most often run into the fears of, how do I survive in a world financially if I answer this calling? How do I, how will I care for a family? So I'm just curious if you could speak to your wisdom, give us wisdom as we think about guiding young people and those called by God when their family system, the voices in their family system are so strong.
It's a long walk to have with you, isn't it? It's a long walk we should have together, isn't it? Yeah. Somebody asked me before we got started, how you doing, Steve? And I, what's your life like? And I said, well, I do my darndest trying to love my wife, my children, my grandchildren. I started there in the answer to the question. And I would say in some ways in my life over the many years in Washington, D.C., I've actually chosen a little bit of not poke you in the eye, but maybe to say, I'm not going to speak, first of all, that I teach undergraduates about political vocation and public policy. That'd be an easy way to answer the question. And what do you do with your life? And you have to answer it in a very professional way. But in some ways, I have for years decided to somehow acknowledge the deeper context of my life, too, as a way of saying, how am I doing? What am I doing these days? Because I do believe that being a father, being a grandfather now, is a big part of who I am. It is part of that complex, rich idea of vocation in the world. Vocation is a deep word, and it's not the same word as work. It isn't the same word as occupation either, in fact. Occupation is a different word. To put it kind of simply, I would say we occupy different relationships and responsibilities over the course of life, hoping that the vocation which is ours deepens and becomes more coherent through the years of our life. But vocation, occupation aren't the same words, really. So I am a grandfather, I'm a father too, and I realize what you're saying with some weight and burden, and when I wake up first thing in the morning, what am I doing? Crying out for my children and grandchildren. What am I doing? For years I've described myself to people, I wake in the morning with my children in my throat. Hoping for them, praying for them, longing for them, wondering about them this day, And I realize that for a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old to grow up with a sense of, the bigger, larger, rich work of God's work in the world, that somehow, maybe in their own even 15-year-old way, there might be some little bit of an idea that vocation is integral to the work of God in the world. Well, in some ways, it's 1,000, moments where the stream runs across the stones. Over time, you're just hoping and hoping. I have my oldest is a granddaughter who's 12 years old. Magdalena is her name. Well, she's slowly being allowed to have some access to a cell phone. Parents are, I think, being conscientious about that. She has little bit of access to a little bit of the, cosmosphere of the internet. But I send her pictures sometimes I've taken. I send her a little note about something. I ask her sometimes to pray for me. I tell her a little bit about what I'm doing. I want in some ways for her to begin to have little growing up ideas about the bigger world and the bigger work of God in the world. Beginning to have language somehow that could make sense of, an idea like vocation that could give meaning and coherence to the whole of her life. So I agree with you, and it's a longer conversation to have, but, it can't be the church if the families of the church are not actually bought into it. It has to be that way. Putting it simply, you're right about that. And we could talk more about that. I have a good friend, a former student of mine at Regent, Tammy Peterson, lives in Dallas, Texas, and she does a lot of work with families on the idea of identifying vocation for adolescents. We could talk more about that. So, yeah. Yes?
Yes, hi, thank you. I teach at a Methodist college, so undergraduates, and we have done quite a bit at our school with vocation. In classes and outside of classes. And there's a debate, discussion among some of our faculty as to whether anybody is actually called to be a radiologist or a dentist or a functionary. And you distinguish between occupations and callings and jobs. Some of us feel that you can be called to your job, and others reserve vocation either for the calling of all Christians or to ministry. So do you understand,
Well,
how do you understand vocation
No.
as calling to a job or not?
That's a good question, and of course it's a question all of us have at a certain point, a certain way. I understand that and honor the question. Again, just to say it, plainly, vocation, calling are really the same idea, the same word, they're just different languages. The best resource about this is a book that actually came out of the Lilly Endowment's work over time by a professor in Indiana. It's called Calling, 20 Centuries of Christian Wisdom on Vocation. It's the edited collection of everybody from the first century through the 20th century, on this. And then I would say worth the price of the book, essays, introducing the next few hundred years. The church thought this in the first 300 years, and then, by the year 700, it began to think this about these, and then by the year 1200, this. And so the essays are worth the price of the whole book, really. It's a brilliant collection. I always would assign that teaching courses on vocation over years now. I want the students to get a sense of the 20 centuries of reflection on this question. And of course, in some ways, as I've said, we've stumbled over this, and we still do most of the time. The Reformation was its own mystery. We'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. And then what happened, of course, not only in the continent, but of course in the United Kingdom, and who were the Anglicans and why they came into being, then the Methodists too, and had the Plymouth Brethren come into being after all that, and the Nazarenes eventually. I mean, it's a complicated story over time, but in that period of post-Luther, Calvin, thinking as it began to move its way into England and Reformation in England, I would say some of the best thinking came out of the Puritan period about this, about that very question you've asked, about different levels of calling, different ways to speak about calling and be theologically serious too. You can't go to Galatians or Corinthians and say, well, he was called, of course, to be a soldier. Then we do have the instruction, go back and be a good soldier. Don't be a bad tax accountant. I mean, it is plainly spoken about in the scriptures. But I would say that over time, we pretty generously and I think meaningfully speak about the vocation of the law. This is the Lanier Theological Library. I'm hoping Mark Lanier has had a sense of vocation in his life that gives substance to the work of his life. I don't know that really at all. We speak about the vocation of the artist, the vocation of the farmer. I use that language when I need to and want to, but I also would realize, that we probably have to talk about it too if you really want to get into it. It is a sans sommet saying, I've been a Christian for what? He's 55 years old now, maybe, since I was, 20 maybe, and I've been part of churches ever since then, part of a pretty serious, good church in Durham, never really heard this idea of vocation before, because we don't talk about that typically in the church. We don't preach about that. We don't sing about that. Isaac, of course, allows us to sing a song about your labor is not in vain this morning. I mean, I would just say to you, dear people, you look at your own hymnals and you wonder, why is it over 2,000 years we've not sung songs about the work of life in the world? You might have a song a little bit like Take My Life and Let It Be, but we just haven't gone there as the church in the world. We've actually, in some ways, thought it mattered enough to our worship to have our work be integrally related to it. Some of you are Old Testament scholars, to have the idea of avodah somehow be woven into our practice as God's people in the world, where worship and work are seen as an integral whole in some way. We haven't done that, really. And I think in some ways for us to move beyond sort of the stumbling over, well, I can see being called to evangelism, but come on, called to be a dentist? Probably not, really, And I would just say that it probably involves pastoral, theological discipleship and instruction in the church to begin to have language that can make more sense of making sense of all of life. But it's a good question. We can talk more about it if you want to. Yeah.
The term that comes to my mind is failure.
It's what?
Failure.
Failure?
So how does either circumstantial or perceived failure fit into people trying to live this out?
Say it a little bit again.
So how does either circumstantial failure in a vocational mindset or perceived failure, how does that fit into the way this works?
Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking.
Oh, you're thinking.
I'm just
sorry.
thinking
Okay.
about the question here. I just wanted to give you
I misread your cue.
No, I'm not saying I dismiss you. I'm not, Hannah Lindsay and Steve Moore here. Don't ask that question. Well, the reality is it is now, but not yet. Eschatologically, that is, we could use other ways to get at that, but whether it's now but not yet or some other way of trying to get at the tension that exists, we'll again speak more about this tomorrow together. But that is the tension for all of us, I don't know you. I know Steve pretty well, Creighton I know a little bit, and I met Steve Rankin along the way, but I don't know most of you really. I assume, brothers and sisters, that you are to me, that everybody in the room has walked into the room today with some sorrow in their hearts. Some disappointment, that brings them into this day on Friday. It could be sort of inch by inch or drop by drop acid rain over disappointing times in the brokenness of the world. It could be that. It could be somehow maybe something more grievous and terrible has happened along the way. But I just assume we probably won't talk about it today together, and I'm not asking that we do that, but everybody here in some way has fallen down. And it could be sort of a grievous, terrible thing that brings shame to all of life. I read an interesting article yesterday that Peggy Noonan had written recently. Fred Smith, Fred passed on to me, and he said it was about John Profumo, the British politician of the 1960s, the Profumo scandal, which is older than some of you are in the room, really. But it was a terrible thing for British politics and British society, and caught with his literal pants down, and he was going to be, the whole government fell because of that, and well, what did he do? Well, Peggy Noonan plays out, well, you see, 2 months later he said, I was sorry, and then but I think British politics needs me, and I need to get back into it, and I'm sure they'll forgive me, Instead, what Profumo did, actually, she writes about very poignantly, is he entered into a kind of a Wesleyan kind of a little community of impoverished people in great need, and spent the next 40 years of his life serving by washing dishes and cleaning toilets and making meals and helping people like that. Is that required of all of us when we fall? I don't know, But in some ways, somehow she was arguing that there was something about the repentance, that of a serious movement from remorse to repentance. Even as I say that, I would simply also say that we all, in our sorrows, and we're all sorrowful people in our own ways, we all have to choose to get up in the morning and somehow again commit ourselves to being the gladness and singleness of heart. Again this day, So how do you keep on keeping on? That'll be more tomorrow. We'll talk about that. But I would say we all stumble over that, sometimes terribly so. And sometimes not so visibly so. But we all have that problem.
I think we better close. We've got our break now coming up, and we've got you here. Did you want to say something?
Yes, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. We look forward to more tomorrow. So save some of your questions for tomorrow. We'll have a little bit more time for you. Okay, logistics-wise, we have a short 15 minutes because we have another great session coming up. So coffee, drinks, restroom breaks. And I would like to share with you, there are gift bags out there this year, okay? And during this time period, I'd love for you to grab a gift bag. In there will be a book that we will use for the next session. So it's important that you all have one. Kind of one per group, or one per household, if you would. And either right now, if you have time, there's also books downstairs. Mark Lanier has published numerous books and would like to share one with you. And there are some that you can look over and pick one out, and that can be done now or later during the day. And then there's also bookmarks, the various bookmarks that you can also pick and choose for your goodie bag this year. So. Awesome. We'll meet back here at 11:30. So be nice and prompt as we are usually.
Thank you for all your help today.
Thanks. You were wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
You bet.